You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, with all eyes on a possible pardon for Ghislaine Maxwell, that draws into sharper focus the situation where Donald Trump and the DOJ fired Maureen Comey, who was one of the prosecutors who actually prosecuted Ghislaine Maxwell. And so, first and foremost, what might the rationale be for the DOJ to fire the prosecutor who had all of the information, pertinent information about this case, just days before they engaged in this new endeavor where they're likely going to offer her some type of sweetheart deal in exchange for absolving Donald Trump?
So I think most directly, here's what I would say the rationale was. When you sit down with a defendant and you want to debrief, that's the term we use, that defendant, to see what kind of information the defendant can provide, typically about the crimes of others, bigger criminal fish. The only appropriate person to sit down with that kind of a defendant who is maybe seeking to strike a bargain with the prosecutors, with the government, is the lead prosecutor. Why? Because the lead prosecutor will instantly know, given the well of information she has about the evidence in the case, because she, Maureen Comey, was the lead prosecutor, she will instantly know if Ghislaine Maxwell is lying or is telling the truth about the ins and outs of the Epstein case, who may have been involved, who might not have been involved. She's the only person to know it. Todd Blanche can't know it because he was not involved in the Epstein or Maxwell investigations, indictments, or the prosecution of Maxwell. So it seems to me, Brian, that even though Maureen Comey is the daughter of one of Donald Trump's avowed enemies, James Comey, the former director of the FBI, they could have fired her the minute Donald Trump took office, right? But instead, she continued to work in her job as a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York U.S. Attorney's Office for 6 months during the first 6 months of Donald Trump's term. She was a highly regarded, well-respected, experienced prosecutor of about a decade, and they didn't fire her during those first 6 months. And just about a week before we learned that Todd Blanche would be the DOJ official to go interview Ghislaine Maxwell, what did Pam Bondi do? She fired Maureen Comey. I mean, those two things are not a coincidence coming so close in time. It seems like they wanted to make sure they would box Maureen Comey out of participating, as she should have, in any interview with Ghislaine Maxwell or any assessment of the credibility, the truthfulness of what Ghislaine Maxwell might have told prosecutors.
So basically, your contention is that knowing the DOJ saw this coming, where they would have to meet with Ghislaine Maxwell because the pressure was on, the heat was building on Donald Trump, she's the only person who is still alive who will be able to expose or reveal any incriminating information about Donald Trump. So they recognize that they would be eventually needing to go speak to Ghislaine Maxwell. The only person who would stand in their way and undermine their ability to be able to manipulate the situation, pervert the situation to their benefit, would be the lead prosecutor on this case, who was still at the DOJ until suddenly she wasn't.
Yeah, and Maureen Comey, by all accounts, is an honest broker of the rule of law and the Constitution. So
she wouldn't have played into these games like Trump wanted her to.
Exactly. And then the next interesting question will become, if Todd Blanche stands up and tries to convince the American public that Ghislaine Maxwell told me that Donald Trump is pure as the driven snow, he never did anything wrong with Jeffrey Epstein or anybody else, but you know who did? A whole bunch of Democrats. If Todd Blanche tries to peddle that kind of bullshit to the American people, Maureen Comey will know whether those claims are truthful or false. And then the question becomes, what does she do with that knowledge?
Exactly. And that's what I was getting to. Is she bound by the same secrecy rules that she would have been bound by when she was still a prosecutor, even after her tenure at the DOJ is up?
Yeah, good question. I've got to pull apart two things. First of all, there is certain information that we come into possession of as prosecutors that is the product of grand jury proceedings. Those are secret by law. We must maintain confidentiality of everything that occurs before the grand jury by law, not just by regulation, rules, and procedures. By law, we must maintain the confidence of it. And that responsibility never leaves us. Even if we leave the Department of Justice, we retire, we still may not disclose matters that occurred before the grand jury. That's the magic language. However, everything else that she may know about in connection with the Epstein and Maxwell investigations and the Maxwell prosecutions that did not occur before the grand jury, there is tons of evidence that was taken by the FBI when they conducted search warrants on Epstein's island, on Epstein's mansion in New York. There are very likely videotapes. There are DVDs that have been referred to in some of the reporting. There is probably literally storage rooms full of Epstein files that are not covered by grand jury secrecy rules and laws. So, could Maureen Comey openly speak about all of that now that she's no longer a DOJ employee? The answer is yes. However, Brian, if she were still a DOJ employee, guess what? She wouldn't be permitted to speak to the press or speak publicly about any of that, even if it wasn't grand jury protected material. Because let me tell you, for decades, I was a federal prosecutor and I had to abide by the rule that we do not speak to the press. We do not speak publicly about any of our work, grand jury or otherwise, unless authorized by our U.S. Attorney and our public affairs officer. So in all my years as a prosecutor, you can go back and click on old news footage. The only time you'll see me talking to the press is when I'm standing on the courthouse steps and I've been authorized, instructed by the U.S. Attorney and the PAO to comment on, for example, a jury's verdict or to comment on a sentence that was imposed by a judge, because, you know, that is when the case was concluded. And that's when I was sort of required in my capacity as a prosecutor, as authorized by the U.S. Attorney, to make a public statement about anything. That's the only time I talk to the press.
So in a way, I mean, if you're bound by DOJ regulations, internal guidance that says that you can't speak to the press, didn't they just kind of unleash Maureen Comey to be able to speak freely as long as it's not anything that's contained within grand jury testimony? Didn't they just unleash her by virtue of firing her to be able to speak freely about what else she knows? They did.
And it was not a wise move. Of course, the question is Maureen Comey the kind of person who is going to be comfortable stepping into the public, light and begin to talk about this? We all know there will be hell to pay. We know that Donald Trump will probably try to retaliate against her the way he's retaliated against her father by directing he be criminally investigated.
Right.
There's no evidence he committed any crime. So it's a decision that she's going to have to make for herself.
And so that's exactly what I want to dig in on, this idea. We know that Trump is going to weaponize the DOJ against her if she does decide to speak out. And so how firm is the footing that she's on to be able to speak out, knowing that Pam Bondi would go after her?
She's on firm legal footing. As long as it's not grand jury protected material, she's on firm legal footing. It really comes down to what kind of a battle does she want to take on with Pam Bondi, Donald Trump, and company. Let me tell you what I would do, Brian. If, for example, I handled, together with other great prosecutors, the biggest RICO prosecution in the history of D.C. federal court. And if I had some political type start to lie about the evidence in the case, the RICO case that I prosecuted, you're damn right I'm going to correct the record very publicly, politely and professionally, but I'm going to say, no, those politicians are spewing lies about the criminal case that I prosecuted together with my great colleagues. So that's a decision Maureen Comey is going to have to make for herself.
Right. I mean, even if she's on firm legal footing, the reality is that if the DOJ goes after you, it's still going to cost you time. It's going to cost you money. It's going to cost you resources. It's going to cost you your sanity, your stress, right? And so it's not just the fact that, okay, at the end of this thing, she's on firm legal ground. It's also what happens in the lead up to, us recognizing, or the courts recognizing rather, that she's not guilty of anything that the DOJ is accusing her of doing.
Yeah, but I have a feeling she strikes me as the kind of person who's going to stand up and do what's right, even if it's not easy. We don't take on the job of federal prosecutor because it's easy
Right.
or it's safe.
Or because you want to cower in the face of somebody doing something illegal.
Yeah, I mean, if this is an all hands on deck moment in this fight for American democracy and for the rule of law against a corrupt presidential administration. And, if I had to lay my $1 bet on what Maureen Comey will do, I'll bet she stands up and very vocally does the right thing.
Well, it would make sense for her to hold off until there's some reason for her to actually speak out and possibly refute some misinformation or disinformation that the Trump administration puts forward. Because once that happens, once she speaks out, all bets are off. And, Trump is going to unleash on her and start from that moment to denigrate her character. And so she's probably holding her powder dry until the moment that it's actually needed, so that she doesn't do it now, has her entire character defamed for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then if and when some misinformation or disinformation about Epstein and Trump or Maxwell comes out, then by then it's already too late, and people aren't going to believe, at least on the right, people aren't going to believe what Maureen Comey says because of all the work Trump has done to discredit her. But if she waits, and the first time she speaks out is when we get that information released by Donald Trump to frame him as some innocent bystander in all of this, then I think it'll have more of an impact.
Yeah, and she should take some comfort in the knowledge that if she is, as you say, defamed by Trump and company for weeks and weeks and weeks for speaking out and telling the truth about the Epstein and Maxwell files and cases, she will be an extraordinarily good company. That company will include people like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. It will include people like Letitia James, Alvin Bragg, Jack Smith. It will include people like her father, James Comey, and former CIA Director John Brennan, and so many others. It will include judges who were appointed by presidents who were Democrats, by presidents who were Republicans, and by Donald Trump himself, who Donald Trump defames early and often, calling them all radical left-wing lunatics, regardless of what president appointed them. She will be in very good company because all of those people have stood up in their own way, done the right thing, and they have suffered the consequences of Donald Trump's defamation. But I'll bet they can sleep well at night knowing that what they did was the right thing to do by the rule of law, by the American people, and by American democracy.
Last question here on this. If Donald Trump does defame Maureen Comey, is there any recourse? Because obviously Trump is protected by virtue of this new provision that the Supreme Court created out of whole cloth in criminal cases, but this is a civil matter when we talk about defamation. And so is there a way that the sitting president could be held liable for defamation while he's still president if he attacks Maureen Comey?
Yeah, so first of all, if there was a viable defamation suit to be brought, it would probably at a minimum be delayed until he left office, perhaps. But more fundamentally, think about E. Jean Carroll, who successfully sued Donald Trump even for conduct and statements he made that were defamatory while he was president. Right. And the reason is, if you are a government official, including President of the United States, and you do things that are beyond the scope of your official duties as a government official or President of the United States, then your immunity yields, your immunity to civil lawsuits yields, and you can potentially be sued. But, there's a lot that goes into whether you can actually and practically sue a sitting president. Not an easy thing to do.
No, but there is a world in which we find the answer to that question in the aftermath of Maureen Comey possibly speaking out. So, look, obviously a lot to happen in this space right now. So for everybody watching, if you'd like to follow along, please make sure to subscribe to both of our channels. The links are right here on this screen. It is completely free. It's the best way to support our work, and it's a great way to support independent media as well. So again, links on this screen, also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.